Dear learners, welcome back to WSE True Stories, where English learning becomes an unforgettable adventure through the lives of history's most extraordinary figures. Today's story takes us into the mind of a genius who saw buildings not as isolated monuments, but as living expressions of nature. A man who defied rigid tradition, who believed that architecture should grow from the earth like a tree grows from the ground. His name? Frank Lloyd Wright. But this isn't just the story of an architect. It's a story of rebellion, of resilience, and of rebuilding. Of bold lines and broken hearts. Of triumphs drawn in stone, and tragedies carved in silence. You're about to meet a man who didn't just design houses, he designed ideals. Who faced bankruptcy, betrayal, and devastating personal loss, yet still rose to become one of the greatest builders the world has ever known. Through this story, you'll not only improve your English vocabulary, listening skills, and comprehension, but you'll also discover how great ideas survive, even when their creator nearly doesn't. This is not just a lesson in language. It's a lesson in vision, courage, and the cost of staying true to your dream. So get ready for one of the most powerful and emotional stories ever told through architecture. Let's start the journey into the life of a man who taught the world how to build with the soul. The story of Frank Lloyd Wright begins in a world still trying to find its shape. He was born on June 8, 1867, in Richland Center, Wisconsin, a small town set among rolling hills and wide skies. The American Civil War had just ended, and the country was rebuilding, not only its cities but its identity. The world was shifting from farms to factories, from wooden cabins to iron skyscrapers. And in this moment of transformation, a child was born who would one day reimagine what buildings could be. His mother, Anna Lloyd-Jones, came from a strong Welsh heritage and was a schoolteacher with fierce determination. She believed her son was destined for greatness. In fact, before he could even walk, she decorated his nursery with architectural drawings and gave him Froebel blocks, wooden cubes and spheres designed to stimulate creativity. She used to say, "Frank will be an architect." His father, William Wright, was a preacher and a musician, a man of big dreams but few practical successes. The Wright family moved often, chasing new starts and escaping old debts. From a young age, Frank lived with instability, but also with an unusual mixture of structure and imagination. His father's sermons gave him rhythm. His mother's teachings gave him vision. But the home he grew up in wasn't warm. It was full of tension. His parents' marriage slowly unraveled, and when Frank was just a teenager, his father walked out, never to return. This wound cut deep. It wasn't just a broken home, it was a broken trust. And it would haunt him for years to come. Still, Frank held on to one thing, the land. The fields and prairies of Wisconsin were his refuge. He watched the way the grasses bent in the wind, how the sunlight passed through trees, how rivers carved through earth. He didn't yet know it, but these landscapes would later shape his most iconic architectural creations. In a world chasing steel and stone, Frank dreamed of buildings that breathed with nature. He once said, "The mother art is architecture. Without an architecture of our own, we have no soul of our own civilization." And so, in a time when America was looking outward, to Europe, to industry, to modernity, Frank Lloyd Wright began to look inward, and downward, into the soil beneath his feet. But his journey to become an architect of global renown would not begin easily. Because before he could create beauty, he had to face chaos. As a young man, Frank Lloyd Wright arrived in Chicago in 1887 with almost nothing, just 19 years old, a head full of ideas, and a heart already bruised by the loss of his father. The city had been destroyed by the Great Fire just 16 years earlier and was now bursting with new construction. Towers were rising. Opportunity was everywhere. For Frank, it felt like a city made for reinvention, just like him. He quickly found work as a draftsman at a leading architectural firm, first at Joseph Lyman Silsby's office, then at the prestigious firm of Adler and Sullivan. It was here, under the mentorship of Louis Sullivan, that Wright found his first true guiding light. Sullivan was already known as the father of skyscrapers, and he taught Wright that form should follow function, that design should be driven by purpose, not decoration. But Wright wasn't content to follow anyone for long. Ambitious and full of raw confidence, he soon began taking on private projects behind Sullivan's back to earn extra money, a direct violation of their agreement. When Sullivan found out, he felt betrayed. The relationship shattered. Wright was fired. This early fall from grace might have ended another man's career. But for Wright, it was fuel. In 1893, he opened his own studio in Oak Park, Illinois, a quiet suburb just outside Chicago. With a small office attached to his family home, he set out to develop a new kind of American architecture. One that was honest, natural, and deeply rooted in place. But even as his creative ambitions soared, his personal life was beginning to fracture. He had married Catherine Tobin, and together they had 6 children. Yet, the weight of family life, the pressure to earn, and the endless hours of design created tension at home. Wright was restless, unpredictable, obsessed with his vision and often emotionally distant. And in the broader world, the challenge was just as sharp. American architecture was still heavily influenced by European traditions, Victorian mansions, Gothic cathedrals, and Beaux-Arts elegance. Wright wanted none of it. He rejected the past. He sought simplicity, openness, horizontal lines. He wanted homes that hugged the earth, not dominated it. Many critics called his designs too strange, too radical. Clients were hesitant. He struggled to gain recognition. While he believed deeply in the soul of his work, others saw only a stubborn young man refusing to play by the rules. But despite the skepticism, Wright pressed on. He began developing what would become his signature, the prairie style, a uniquely American form of architecture inspired by the landscape of the Midwest. Flat roofs, long rows of windows, low lines that stretched outward like the horizon. Inside, spaces flowed freely from one room to another, erasing the boundaries of boxy Victorian homes. Still, his reputation grew slowly. His ideas were bold, but the world wasn't ready to follow. And the pressures around him were growing louder. Mounting debt. Family obligations. A restless spirit. An industry slow to change. Frank Lloyd Wright was no longer a boy in a field of dreams. He was a man at war, with tradition, with critics, and perhaps most dangerously, with himself. But the true test of his spirit was yet to come. By the dawn of the 20th century, Frank Lloyd Wright was no longer just experimenting, he was building a philosophy. He called it organic architecture, the belief that buildings should grow naturally from their environment, not fight against it. His houses were not meant to impose, they were meant to belong. But as his ideas began to mature, so did the pressure around him. He was constantly short on money. His studio was thriving with apprentices and draftsmen, yet the income never seemed to match the ambition. He lived beyond his means, often investing in lavish materials and complex designs he couldn't quite afford. His debts grew, as did his reputation, for brilliance and for trouble. Then came a choice that would define the next chapter of his life. In 1903, Wright took on a commission that would become one of his early masterpieces, the Darwin D. Martin House in Buffalo, New York. It was a sprawling residential complex unlike anything the East Coast had seen. Horizontal planes, intricate leaded glass windows, open spaces that flowed like air, it was architectural poetry. Martin became a patron and friend, supporting Wright even when others hesitated. But even as his professional star began to rise, his personal life was sliding into chaos. Frank had grown increasingly distant from his wife, Catherine. Their relationship was strained not just by financial tension and Wright's emotional distance, but also by the constant demands of his work and ego. Then, in 1909, he did something few saw coming, something that shocked polite society and nearly destroyed his career. He abandoned his wife and children. He left them behind in Oak Park and fled to Europe with Mama Borthwick Cheney, the wife of one of his former clients. Their affair had been hidden, then whispered about, then exposed in headlines. The scandal erupted like wildfire. In conservative America, this was more than a personal decision, it was a public disgrace. Newspapers condemned him. Clients withdrew. His practice dried up. Yet, during his year in Europe, Wright wasn't hiding. He was learning, traveling, absorbing the works of Japanese art, visiting the cathedrals and streets of Italy, sketching visions that would become the seeds of his future work. When he returned to the United States, he did so not to reconcile, but to rebuild. He chose a plot of land in Spring Green, Wisconsin, near the family of his beloved Mama. There, he began constructing what would become one of the most important, and most fateful, buildings of his life, Taliesin. Taliesin wasn't just a home or a studio. It was a declaration. Built into the rolling hills, using local stone and sand, it was Wright's first complete embodiment of organic architecture. It curved with the landscape, open to the light, breathed with the wind. It was not just a place to live, it was a place to believe. But even in this moment of creative clarity, the scandal still lingered. The architectural establishment turned its back. The American Institute of Architects refused to honor him. Friends distanced themselves. His name became synonymous not with innovation, but with immorality. And the work slowed. But Wright remained defiant. He once said, "Early in life I had to choose between honest arrogance and hypocritical humility. I chose the former, and have seen no reason to change." Still, behind that arrogance was a man trying to prove something, not just to the world, but to himself. That he could still create beauty. That he could still shape the future. That Taliesin would be his sanctuary. But even sanctuaries can be shattered. And in the coming years, a tragedy unlike anything he had faced would test him beyond imagination. Do you think Wright's decision to leave his family for love destroyed or deepened his genius? Tell us in the comments, because what happened next would leave the world stunned. By 1914, Frank Lloyd Wright had poured his soul into Taliesin. Nestled in the hills of Wisconsin, it stood as a symbol of everything he believed in: freedom, beauty, and the union of man and nature. It was more than a home. It was a statement, a rebellion, a dream turned into stone and glass. And in that dream, he shared a life with Mama Borthwick, his partner in both love and ideals. Though their relationship had brought scandal and exile, Taliesin had become their refuge, their shared world of intellect, art, and quiet passion. But then came the day that changed everything. August 15, 1914. Wright was away in Chicago, working on a project. Back at Taliesin, Mama, her 2 visiting children, and several workers and guests were having lunch in the residential quarters known as the living quarters of the estate. What happened next was almost too horrific to comprehend. One of Wright's employees, Julian Carleton, a disgruntled servant from Barbados, suddenly sealed the exits of the house, doused parts of it with gasoline, and set it on fire. As people tried to escape the flames, he stood outside with an axe, and began striking them down one by one. 7 people died that day, including Mama and her 2 children. The beautiful refuge Wright had built with so much care was reduced to ashes. The love of his life was gone. His sanctuary was now a grave. When he received the news, Wright collapsed. He rushed back to Taliesin, only to find the charred ruins of his dream. Journalists swarmed the scene. Headlines screamed. The world watched with a strange mix of horror and fascination. Some critics whispered it was punishment for his sins. Others pitied him. But no one remained indifferent. Wright's life was broken, personally, spiritually, and emotionally. Most would have given up. And for a while, it seemed he might. He withdrew from public life. He wandered. He brooded. He was a man hollowed by grief. He later wrote, "A house is not 4 walls and a roof, it is the spirit that lives inside." But Taliesin's spirit had been murdered. He now lived in its echo. And yet, even in the darkness, something stirred in him. A flicker. A faint line on the sketch pad. The smallest sense that perhaps, just perhaps, rebuilding wasn't betrayal, it was survival. So he began again. Slowly, painfully, he started to reconstruct Taliesin, stone by stone. Not in denial, but in defiance. As if by rebuilding it, he could honor those who were lost, preserve their memory, and continue the purpose they had shared. The new Taliesin wasn't exactly the same. It carried scars. Shadows. It was haunted and sacred at the same time. But it was also more powerful, because it had survived. And so had he. Wright was no longer just an architect. He was a man who had walked through the fire and chosen not to remain ash. This tragedy changed him. He became more solitary, more focused, but also more urgent. His designs grew bolder. His philosophy deepened. His belief in architecture as emotional, healing, and spiritual grew unshakable. He once said, "The truth is more important than the facts." And the truth was this: he had loved, lost, and endured, and through that suffering, something timeless was born. From this point on, Wright's life would be a constant push forward. But that moment, in the ruins of Taliesin, was the pivot. It was no longer about proving others wrong. It was about proving that beauty could survive tragedy. That light could return to places that had once known only smoke. If someone you loved deeply were taken from you, could you rebuild from the ashes, or would the pain silence your voice forever? Let us know in the comments, because what Frank Lloyd Wright did next would redefine not just his life, but the very future of architecture. After the tragedy at Taliesin, Frank Lloyd Wright could have chosen silence. Many would have. He was nearly 50, already infamous, scarred by scandal, and now shattered by grief. The architectural world had largely moved on without him. Younger, cleaner reputations were taking center stage. Yet instead of retreating, Wright decided to build louder, stranger, and more daring than ever before. But genius comes at a cost. In the years following the fire, Wright threw himself into work with a kind of feverish obsession. He became his own force of nature, unpredictable, proud, and wildly prolific. But while his creative mind soared, his financial and personal life grew ever more unstable. He took on projects he couldn't fund. He dreamed on paper what reality couldn't always support. He alienated clients with his arrogance, burned bridges with collaborators, and often refused to compromise on even the smallest details. If a client wanted a window moved, he refused. If someone suggested another material, he dismissed them. This refusal to bend cost him dearly. In 1922, he divorced Catherine and married a woman named Miriam Noel. The relationship was short, tempestuous, and destructive. Miriam was addicted to morphine, prone to violent outbursts, and mentally unstable. Their public fights and legal battles became another dark chapter in Wright's already colorful biography. And then came the economic collapse. The Great Depression swept across America in the 1930s, bringing most construction to a halt. Wright, now in his 60s, was nearly broke. Commissions dried up. Critics called him a relic of another era. He was out of fashion, too emotional, too artistic in an age demanding utility and simplicity. He could have faded quietly. But once again, Wright chose defiance. In 1932, he opened the Taliesin Fellowship, an architectural apprenticeship program based at his home studio. He welcomed young idealists from across the country to come live, work, and learn under his guidance. It was part school, part commune, part spiritual retreat. Apprentices farmed the land, cooked meals, and studied under the sharp eye of a master who expected nothing less than complete devotion. But that devotion came at a price. Wright was demanding, sometimes cruel. He broke down his students to rebuild them in his image. He lived with them, taught them, worked beside them, but always from above. He was the center of the world they had entered. And though many would go on to become great architects, many would also leave with bruises, emotional, financial, and creative. And yet, even during these chaotic years, Wright was preparing for his most astonishing act of all. In 1935, at the age of 67, he received a commission from Edgar Kaufman, a wealthy department store owner in Pittsburgh. Kaufman wanted a weekend home in rural Pennsylvania, near a waterfall the family loved to visit. Wright listened. He sketched. Then he shocked the world. Instead of placing the house next to the waterfall, he placed it over the waterfall. The result was Fallingwater, a house that seemed to grow out of the rock, suspended in air, embraced by trees and water and light. It was unlike anything anyone had ever seen. A true masterpiece of organic architecture, where form, function, and nature merged into one living idea. Fallingwater wasn't just a comeback, it was a resurrection. Suddenly, the world was listening again. Magazines celebrated him. New students flocked to Taliesin. Even his enemies began to acknowledge his brilliance. At an age when most slowed down, Wright was speeding up. But the truth remained, this moment of triumph had come only after decades of sacrifice. His reputation, his fortune, his family, even his peace of mind. Frank Lloyd Wright had risked everything, time and again, for a vision that only he could see. And now, at last, the world was catching up. The unveiling of Fallingwater in 1937 marked more than a professional triumph for Frank Lloyd Wright, it marked a cultural moment. Suddenly, the man who had been dismissed as eccentric, outdated, and unmanageable was being hailed as a genius once again. And the momentum didn't stop there. At the age of 70, when most architects were retiring, Wright entered the most prolific and ambitious phase of his life. He designed hundreds of projects, homes, museums, churches, civic centers, and community plans. His late career work exploded with color, geometry, and daring imagination. Among these, perhaps none stands taller than the Solomon R. Guggenheim Museum in New York City. Commissioned in 1943 but not completed until 1959, just months after Wright's death, the Guggenheim was a declaration of everything he had stood for. It was not a boxy white cube like most museums of its time, it was a spiral, a swirling white seashell of a building that challenged gravity and convention. Instead of walking through rooms, visitors descended a long ramp that curved continuously along the walls. Art was no longer hung on grids, it was experienced in motion, as Wright believed it should be. Critics were divided. Some called it a temple. Others called it a monstrosity. But no one ignored it. And that, in many ways, had always been Wright's quiet goal, to demand that architecture matter. To make people feel something, not just about the buildings, but about themselves inside them. By the end of his life, Wright had designed over 1,000 structures, and more than 500 were completed. His work influenced generations of architects around the globe. He received every major award in the field, including the Royal Gold Medal and the AIA Gold Medal. In 1991, decades after his passing, the American Institute of Architects named him the greatest American architect of all time. But more important than awards was something else he had earned: vindication. He had proved that you could follow your own rules, endure the cost, and still shape the future. That a man who had been cast out could still become a father of modern design. That after fire, after loss, after disgrace and debt and loneliness, one could still build not just homes, but hope. And it wasn't just in museums or famous houses. His ideas echoed in modest homes, in suburban layouts, in the open concept interiors we take for granted today. His belief that architecture should reflect its environment and nurture the soul helped usher in green design, sustainable planning, and human-centered building principles. His buildings were not monuments. They were messages. And those messages reached far beyond bricks and mortar. Wright's story is not just about architecture, it's about persistence, identity, and believing in a vision no one else can see. Even when the world says no. Especially then. Frank Lloyd Wright passed away in 1959, just a few months before the opening of the Guggenheim Museum. He was 91 years old, and until his final days, he remained deeply involved in his work, sketching, teaching, dreaming. Death, for Wright, was not the end. His buildings, his philosophy, and his legacy were already immortal. He had once said, "The longer I live, the more beautiful life becomes." And perhaps that was his deepest truth, not just in words, but in design. Because for Wright, architecture wasn't about stone and steel. It was about people. About life. About the spaces where we live, love, suffer, heal, and grow. His legacy lies not only in the buildings that bear his name, but in the values they embody. Nature and harmony. Individuality and courage. Simplicity with soul. He taught us that buildings should be alive, that walls could breathe, that windows could frame not just light, but meaning. He gave America its own architectural language, one that wasn't imported from Europe, but grown from the soil of its own land and spirit. He also taught us something more personal. That mistakes don't define a legacy. That even deeply flawed people can create lasting good. That vision often comes wrapped in controversy, and that greatness is rarely easy to understand in the moment. Wright's life was full of contradiction. He was both brilliant and difficult, inspiring and infuriating. But through all of it, he remained relentlessly true to his vision. That, perhaps, is his greatest lesson. Because in the end, the world didn't remember the scandals. It remembered the spaces. The way Fallingwater sings with the river. The way Taliesin hugs the hillside. The way the Guggenheim spirals into the sky like an idea made visible. These are not just structures. They are invitations to think differently, to feel deeply, to live meaningfully. And today, as cities rise higher and faster than ever, as buildings compete for size and spectacle, Frank Lloyd Wright reminds us to pause and ask, is what we build in harmony with who we are? Or are we just stacking boxes? If you were to design a space that reflects your soul, what would it look like? Let us know in the comments, because maybe the blueprint of our lives is still being drawn. Dear learners, what a journey we've just taken. Through fire and fame, betrayal and beauty, Frank Lloyd Wright showed us what it means to live boldly, and to build with meaning. His life reminds us that the world isn't just something we live in, it's something we help shape. Every choice, every structure, every dream we draw, becomes part of the landscape of history. And that's true not just for architects, but for all of us. You don't need to design skyscrapers to build something important. You're already building your life, your relationships, your voice. Wright's legacy reminds us to build with purpose, with harmony, and with courage. So if you've ever felt out of place, misunderstood, or like your ideas were too different, remember, those are often the very people who leave the deepest impact. We hope this story helped you not only practice English, improve your vocabulary, and strengthen your listening, but also touched your heart. If it did, share this story. Carry Frank Lloyd Wright's message of beauty and resilience forward. Let's grow a community that values depth, meaning, and inspiration. And don't forget, like, comment, and subscribe to WSE True Stories for more powerful journeys like this one. Now, a question for you before we say goodbye. What lesson do you think can be learned from Frank Lloyd Wright's life? Or, what part of this story stayed with you the most? We'd love to read your reflections. Until next time. Keep learning, keep dreaming, and keep building something that matters. Goodbye for now.